Okay, so we will begin today's presentation, which is about APIs for data liquidity during pandemic times. The presentation today will be moderated by Research Director and Senior Analyst Brian Murphy, who is our interoperability and analytics expert here at chlmrk Research, and he will be discussing this topic with Drew Ivan from Lineate, Dr. Dave Levin from Datica, and G. Shah from Change Healthcare. So just a little bit about chlmrk Research before we hop into the discussion. Our team is united by a core belief that effective deployment and use of IT is essential to modernizing care delivery and improving the care journey for all stakeholders. We provide comprehensive, objective, high-quality research for busy executives. It is our way to help create a more informed, future-ready market of products and customers in healthcare that are using technology to its fullest potential. It is our role in this industry to provide clarity in an uncertain time. Without further ado, here's your host, Brian Murphy.
So this slide right here just gives you kind of a brief sense of what the flow is going to be like here today. I'm going to make just a few introductory comments to kind of set up the topic, after which each of our panelists will tell you a little bit about their company and their place in the API world. But the meat and potatoes of this entire webinar is going to be a discussion between myself and our panelists. But towards the end, we will have we've set aside plenty of time for any questions that you who are listening from the comfort of your own home or your own office, any that you might have, we'd love to hear from you. The reason we're talking about APIs has to do with the new requirements out of CMS and HHS for organizations to build APIs. APIs, for the most part, apply to a set of organizations, or these new rules apply to a set of organizations, and they, for the most part, focus on only certain types of data. It's important to recognize that APIs are truly general purpose technology and a general purpose approach towards making data more liquid. They make certain aspects of development and integration far more straightforward. They also pay dividends in terms of maintenance farther down the road. They basically make it easier to access data outside your organization and in different applications. An important thing that APIs do that these rules don't really reach is they provide services as well. So in other words, they're not just for data. Anybody who's involved in development and integration projects has to figure out where to get the data they need. They usually find that the holders of that data, it turns out that the data that they actually hold can be fragmented. That is, there are real gaps in terms of assembling the bigger picture for that development project, whether that's the full longitudinal patient record or something narrower than that. It's unusual for any one holder to have all the data that any particular development project is going to need. They also find that there's a lot of overlap and duplication inside those organizations. They also find it easier to work with certain kinds of data holders as well. In other words, there's really no such thing as a one-stop shop for developers in terms of getting to the data that they need. Fortunately, there are many vendors in this market who can help developers and projects, whether they're internal and from inside an IT organization or it's a truly independent third party. And those vendors can kind of help people sort through the challenges and to a certain extent overcome them. We have 3 such vendors with us today. Change Healthcare works with an extremely broad swath of the healthcare industry, and G will tell us a little bit more about that. Lineate and its predecessor companies have been involved in integration projects for many, many years in nearly every nook and cranny in healthcare. Finally, Datica has both the network and experience with a pretty wide array of different kinds of integration projects. And each of these are going to describe a little bit more about their company, and after which we will begin our discussion. So G, we'll start with you.
Thanks for having me on the panel. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone is safe and well. in these, shall we say, unprecedented times. Let me very quickly tell you a little bit about Change Healthcare and what we do. Probably the biggest message I deliver here is Change Healthcare operates at the scale of the US healthcare ecosystem. Through our very broad portfolio of products, we touch substantially all physicians, hospitals, caregiving organizations, as well as folks like pharmacies and people that are doing imaging. And we do this through our intelligent healthcare platform, which is our underlying platform that allows us to gather all the data that comes through our networks, turn that data into usable, privacy protected, secure models that we can then turn into insights, those insights that we can then deliver out to our customers in a variety of different ways, APIs being one of them. The other thing I want to point out, again, just from the perspective of scale, is just how much of the system we touch. On an annual basis, we do somewhere in the range of 15 billion healthcare transactions, totaling about $1.5 million in claims. We touch, in various different ways, 1 in 3 US patient records. And so, again, this is just a simple illustration of scale, why we do what we do and how we do it through the use of our platform. And as I'll show you on our next slide, how we use the power of that platform and the scale of our business to really try to drive solutions in the way that Brian talked about, where we can use APIs to deliver things into the workflow, deliver data, deliver optimization, deliver efficiencies, and ultimately deliver better experiences that deliver better outcomes. So if you go to the next slide, the way that we think about APIs, first and foremost, is that they're first-class products inside our product portfolio. And we have the Change Healthcare Marketplace, which is our way of engaging the broader healthcare ecosystem in how to use our APIs. It's important to note that all of our products are available in that marketplace, but since we're talking about APIs today, it's important to point out that we think about APIs as first-class products, SaaS products, if you will, which means we don't just think about them as simple integrations. We don't think about them even as elegant integrations. We think about them as products with a product lifecycle, with a set of value propositions that we can use to engage this idea that we have increased consumerization, this idea that we need to drive better interoperability, and ultimately get to a point where we can drive the use of those APIs to as many people as possible. Understanding that our core value proposition here is we do this every day, day over day. And so we've built a set of expertise as application developers, health IT companies, or others that are using the APIs. You don't have to worry about doing what we do. Worry about creating the best algorithms, the best experiences, and ultimately the things that drive the best outcomes, and leverage the way that we create our APIs to power how you optimize those workflows and ultimately get to better outcomes. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. So Drew, do you want to take it away? Oh,
this is Dave, actually.
I beg your pardon. My mistake. Mark, could you please? Drew, you'll be up next.
Hey, everybody. Dr. Dave Levin here. Pleasure to join you today. I'm the co-founder and chief medical officer at Datica. And just like to talk to you a minute about the work we do and its relevance to the conversation today. Our mission is really to remove key barriers to innovation in digital health. And as a result, we focus on 2 of the biggest challenges in health IT today: integration and public cloud compliance. Now, I confess, I'm a storyteller. And so when it comes to integration, it's quite a story and it's been quite a journey for Datica. We set out to build a robust clinical API in 2014. And back then, APIs weren't new, but they were new to healthcare. And it was fascinating. We were often met with kind of puzzled looks, and I called it the "what are these APIs you speak of" kind of response. And it's not that people in healthcare technology are stupid or lazy or anything like that. It's just we had legacy technology we had used for many years, and API technology just hadn't really penetrated to healthcare. But boy, we've come a long way in 6 years. APIs are really becoming the new normal. We've seen the emergence of FHIR as a kind of nascent standard. And of course, we've got the mandates now from HHS, sort of combination of actions between CMS and ONC that basically says, thou shalt adopt and use APIs for integration. And so, I think that's tremendous progress in a relatively short period of time. And of course, I'm proud of what we've done at Datica. I'd simply note we were recently ranked as a top performer in the category by Chillmark. Thank you to our colleagues at Chillmark. The other thing I would comment on is, although it's not a focus of today's webinar, it's interesting that Brian also referenced the cloud and cloud services in his opening. And I would note that the story on healthcare's adoption of the public cloud and services like Amazon Web Services and Amazon Azure, to me, very much mirrors that of APIs. Other industries are well along in migrating to this next generation of powerful services. And we're not talking about someone else's hard drive in the sky here. We're talking about powerful building blocks for advanced, scalable, and resilient applications. And now healthcare has begun that migration, likely to accelerate due to the COVID pandemic. And that's why at Datica, we're also focused on a key challenge there, which is achieving, maintaining, and demonstrating compliance with privacy and security regimes like HIPAA and high trust. And I kind of see these two things going together. As more and more of this data is going to flow through the public cloud, it's really not just about exchanging the information, but making sure that you're doing it in ways that are compliant and that you can demonstrate it. So I'm sure we're going to get into the deeper details of this today. I'm happy to be here with such esteemed colleagues, and I look forward to what I think is going to be an enlightening and entertaining discussion. Thanks to chlmrk for bringing us all together today.
Thank you, Dave. Drew, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. I'm Drew Ivan, the Chief Product and Strategy Officer at Lineate. And I thought I'd give you a quick background on the company. Lineate as a company is only a little over a year old, but we're built from the merger of two very seasoned products. We're the merger of CorePoint and Rhapsody. Both products have been in the market for over 20 years. And so we bring all of that experience to the new organization with us. At Lineate, we're best known for our integration engines. CorePoint and Rhapsody both serve a variety of market segments throughout healthcare as integration engine tools, but we're really an organization that's dedicated to solving interoperability problems. And so we're taking on projects that go beyond the traditional scope of what you might think of for an integration engine. So on the next slide, I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of a little bit of our profile and the scope that we have. You can see that we have over 1,000 customers around the world, and we try to leverage the experience we have from serving them to help understand where the industry is going in the future. And so hoping to bring some of those insights from our customer base into this conversation today. But with that, we can move on and get started on the Q&A period.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. So we've got a number of topics that we're going to kind of talk about here for 20 minutes or so. Anybody who's listening, please feel free to enter questions, and we will get to those once we sort of get through the questions that we had discussed amongst ourselves beforehand. So just to kind of kick things off, can we, think about and let's start with COVID-19, because that was sort of kind of one of the reasons that we kind of put this thing together. It's not just about interoperability and APIs. Consider the counterfactual. In other words, what if API-based integration, and Dave, you mentioned, how this is sort of a new type topic here in healthcare. If, we had started on this path, say 10 years ago, when, many other industries kind of began on this journey, if we had started then, how do you think things would have changed? How do you think the response to COVID-19 might have evolved differently? Dave, you want to start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating question, and I think there's sort of two answers to it. The first is the data would just be more liquid to begin with, and we'd see less technical barriers to gathering and exchanging the information, and as we've seen, a lot of the challenge right now is collating that data so that we can get community views, statewide views, national views, and frankly, to study the data and the patterns so we can learn and adjust to this novel virus. So I think there's very little doubt that the technical barriers would have been much lower if we were all consistently using some sort of API framework. It's kind of inherent in the technology. I mean, nothing's 100% plug and play, but it certainly is an easier barrier to overcome than some of the legacy technologies. I think the other thing that's kind of intriguing is it would have likely put us in a position where we could also evolve more quickly. So one can assume that there's some basic things that you're going to want to predict and data that you're going to want to share in any pandemic situation. And you could build out a kind of standardized framework for that. But it's also reasonable to believe that on the fly, there are going to be things unique to the particular situation, data elements that you may not have anticipated as part of that standard. And again, API technology, it's relatively easy to flex, to extend, to adjust without breaking things that are already in place. So again, I would argue we probably would be in a much better place in terms of exchanging the data for more rapid analysis and insights. And we would have been in a position to be able to adjust easily and on the fly to new conditions. And I see G is nodding with me. I always feel better when G is in agreement with me.
We have to be careful, Dave. We agree with each other a lot.
Yeah. Well, you're a smart guy, G. What can I say?
Right back at you.
So Drew, any further observations on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, the question asked, what would it look like if we had started the API journey 10 years ago? I mean, we didn't start quite 10 years ago, but it may be a little known fact that we actually did start about 7 years ago. There were some reports from the JSON task force in 2013 and 2014 that advocated an approach to interoperability centered around every healthcare IT system exposing APIs and exchanging data that way. Now, granted, that was very early, sort of a notional architecture. It wasn't enough to act on, but I mean, it goes to show you that we have been working on this problem for a long time. In fact, even the ONC and CMS rules that were finalized in March of 2020, were passed into law in December of 2016. So it took 3.5 years to get enough time to think about what that implementation needed to look like, to put some detail around what those FHIR APIs wanted to be. And for sure, if we had the APIs in a state where they were more fully rolled out today, I think that, as Dave said, we would have a lot more flexibility and be better able to react. You could imagine APIs helping out a lot with like the contact tracing efforts. APIs and mobile devices work well together. It's not quite true that they depend on each other, but a lot of mobile apps are built upon APIs. Yeah. And those contact tracing apps, oftentimes, there's different flavors of contact tracing, but the one that became popular during this pandemic was one that was based on location services within the population's mobile devices. And so you can imagine that having that app on your mobile device and having APIs that could connect to your healthcare records across different institutions on the same mobile device would be an interesting combination to help solve that contact tracing problem.
Gee, any thoughts? Or
I couldn't agree more with Drew and Dave, especially as it relates to having access to data and using the data to drive those insights and ultimately that surveillance. But I think there's actually three things that the pandemic has brought into really clear focus, at least for me. One is that we can't really provide great care, great surveillance, great ability for a provider to understand what's going on with the patient without that data. But there's really two other things. One is the overall patient's experience, which is still today very fragmented. And I think COVID brought that into sharp focus because you can't go from point to point in that journey without transiting applications, transiting systems, transiting experiences, and having a robust layer of APIs underneath that could make the data liquid underneath those experiences could relate to give us something that we kind of expect everywhere else in the world. If I want to go schedule a visit to a hotel, it's one experience and it's end to end. From the time I want to shop to the time I want to book, the time I want to pay, to the time I stay, and everything that happens there. And so having the APIs underneath, which power those experiences everywhere else, would have been great, especially in a time where we wanted to make it easier for patients to get care. And then the third area is access. I mean, we've seen it with rural areas. We saw it with the rise of telemedicine. I mean, I'd like to think that if we'd started this journey 10 years ago, once we hit the point where people could not leave their homes, telemedicine would have been a first-class type of care modality. And that is 100% driven by the ability to have APIs and data and exchanging data between various different providers underneath.
Yeah. So we really don't know to what extent telehealth is going to be here. I mean, it will be here to stay in some form, probably not in its current form. If we just think to the very next stage of this pandemic, I mean, there will come a time here, probably in the next, there will come a time when we need to start thinking about vaccine administration. Unclear when. But that it does seem to me that's even though it's an actual different thing from a medical standpoint, from an IT standpoint, it has a lot of the same dynamics of in terms of what's happened to us already. People are going to have to go to some set of places. They're going to want to schedule. They're going they're not going to be able to. It's not all going to happen inside doctors' offices and hospitals and clinics. So anyway, so the challenges of this pandemic will just kind of keep rolling on until we achieve herd immunity. Obviously, in our industry, there are a lot of very large incumbents. From your guys' company's perspective, what do you think some of the consequences of and these large incumbents have very different approaches. Some are sort of more receptive to this idea, some are less receptive. What do you think are some of the consequences of that kind of, those differences as you look across the broad landscape?
I guess I'll start. So, I think we've pointed out that there's these issues of providing insights, and those insights deliver better experiences and ultimately better care. And so when you have this continuum, if you will, of interoperability, this continuum of access to data, I think we suffer from a lack of being able to get the full picture around the health of the individual and ultimately the health of the population. So when we think about driving down the ability, I should say that differently, driving down the cost of care, driving down the waste of overused tests or repeated tests or things like that, where a provider cannot actually get a patient's information. So they have to rerun tests, rerun diagnostics, get all the data again. That takes time, that takes effort, that takes money. So I think that's one great opportunity that we can leverage if all the data becomes liquid. And when it's not, then you'll have pockets where some patients get great care because their data is available to their providers in a simple and easy way. And there will be other cases where patients can't get that. And ultimately that will cause this discontinued imbalance of inefficiency in the system and continued imbalance of care across both the population and the individual.
I think it's been fascinating to watch different stakeholders respond to the emergence of APIs and this question of data liquidity. To me, the fundamental is the emergence of the adoption of API technology in healthcare has dramatically lowered the technical barriers to exchanging data. And it has revealed the role that business and culture play as barriers. It's part of why the ONC and CMS include rules and guidance around information blocking, because part of what they recognized was this is not simply a technical barrier. A lot of this is about behaviors.
Yeah.
To me, it goes to a fundamental philosophical question about value. Do you believe that hoarding data, having all the data or more data than your competitor is a competitive advantage? And there's a case for that. I think a lot of people believe that. I've come to believe, in fact, it's data in motion that is the competitive advantage. And it seems there are a number of industries that have kind of recognized that as well. There are other ways to compete, but that this is probably not a particularly productive way to compete. So whether we're talking about health IT vendors or health systems or others, I think many are wrestling kind of with this question of what's the value of my data? What's the value of allowing that data to flow? And And Brian, I think you've pointed out, I think it's just an observable fact. You can look at behaviors of some of these companies, and it's pretty obvious. And they kind of fall on a spectrum. And so you see some that they've put big bets on an open approach. Their belief is that if their systems are open, extensible, and that the data can flow readily, that will be a competitive advantage for them and for those who use their systems. And then you have others that are clearly operating on a almost a one platform model and operate as closed as they possibly can. And then then there are some that kind of sit in the middle and some days appear schizophrenic. Obviously, given my background and my work, I believe that not only is it the right thing to do, but I think it is, from a business perspective, it's a competitive advantage to be open, to be extensible. I think there's plenty of evidence in other economic sectors that that's true. I would like to see more of that in healthcare. To some degree, that is customer driven. And so organizations that are buying these systems need to think hard about what they're getting. And to be direct, if I'm a health system and I've spent a lot of money installing an electronic health record, and I've trained and I pay my staff to collect and enter that data, the data belongs to the patients legally, the vast majority of it. And I think my obligation is, and my competitive advantage is, to make that as accessible as I possibly can, with obviously the appropriate security and privacy and respect for individual autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that, but I'm just, in the back of my mind, I am wondering if there are health systems out there who, for lots of different reasons, will be under pressure to monetize that data.
Well, they sort of are, right, Brian? I mean, if you think about the incentives that the health systems have to take care of the population and to drive to a point where we have true value-based care, they are in a sense monetizing their ability to access and make that data broadly available, because they're getting that data into the hands of the people that can provide better care. And I think we all would agree that the better care we can provide the population when they're not actually sick, but from a health maintenance perspective, makes the system more efficient, drives the cost of the system down, and ultimately benefits everybody. That by itself is monetization. It's not necessarily, hey, I'm going to sell you an insight, turn that insight into something that's a pure dollar.
Every industry uses the data that they generate as their transactions as a way to get better at future transactions. And I mean, we do it in healthcare too. We just do it at a very slow pace. That's what clinical trials are, for example. And there is the concept of a learning health system where we can speed up that cycle. And the first prerequisite is tracking the data electronically. And we put that in place, in 2008, 2009, when Meaningful Use promoted the adoption of electronic medical records. And I think now we have a chance to accelerate that cycle again by promoting the liquidity of data through the API approach.
I think it also kind of turns on your view of innovation and improvement. Yeah. And I'm a big believer that competition really drives innovation and improvement. And to me, there's this very direct through line from the data can flow to, and by that I mean not just from one large entity to another, but to anybody that wants to get in that game. That allows a flowering of ideas. Hopefully, through competition, the best emerge and become embedded. And so I think that's another, you can look at that economically from a number of different viewpoints. I think organizations that are betting on a more open strategy are both doing what Drew has suggested, which is it's the insights they gain from the data, not the hoarding of the data. It's putting those insights into action. It's competing based on those analytics is where they're seeing value. And I think the second is it just allows for a more organic kind of innovation and evolution of their own work and of the kinds of products and services they can select for.
And Dave, in the previous response, you talked about a continuum from fully closed to fully open systems. Would you say that these rules from ONC and CMS are a signal from the government that they're trying to turn the dial and say the fully closed system that we've been operating in for 10 years is not acceptable? we need to turn the dial from 0 to, at least 1 or 2, if not all the way up to 10.
I think it's unquestionable that that's the case. And again, for me, the sort of organizing idea behind a lot of that is the federal government's recognition that we do need more competition in healthcare, and that this is one of the barriers. I mean, I can build an incredible, algorithm or device, but if I can't integrate it into the IT ecosystem of the healthcare, if it can't effectively collaborate and inject itself into the workflow, it's highly unlikely that it's going to get the results we want or that I'm going to be successful.
Think about there's 1,200 companies out there or more, right, that are classified as digital health companies. And you talk about innovation, that is where the next great opportunity to improve workflow, come up with a new insight, the next diagnostic algorithm, the next experience is going to come from. And with the data open and available for everyone to use, we can open that innovation up to everyone. I mean, it'd be great. It would be great to think if there were just small pockets where that could happen, but I'm a big believer in leveraging what we've learned everywhere else in the technology industry and saying, how do we start to adopt that? How do we start to apply that? Those experiences can really transform how we provide care, but not going to happen if we can't provide the data to those application providers. And CMS in their latest rule pointed that out very clearly.
So just to pick up on that point a little bit, these rules are about FHIR, they're about USCDI, but that is really a narrow way to think about the opportunity here, I think is your point. So how should organizations be thinking more broadly about, scope of data and thinking about APIs really as a general purpose way and strategy?
I think it's API first. And I know if there's a certain class of people in the audience are going, well, of course, G, of course it's API first.
Yeah.
But it's funny when we deal with people that come into healthcare from outside of healthcare. Right? Everybody out here in the valley that's like, I know how to solve that problem. They come into the environment, right? So where are the APIs? And they're met with this, like, I don't know, what are you talking about?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's a broad mindset change. And you know what? We have this conversation with all of our product teams inside Change Healthcare as well as everyone else. You have to rethink how you go solve the problem. The problem starts with how are we going to go create something that is focused on the user, and then how do you use the APIs as the next layer to make sure that the experience you're creating is connected up to all the different pieces that live behind. I think the other piece is, and we can't not address that FHIR is an emerging standard, but it's at least a standard. It's a place for us to start from, and it's a place that we have a mandate for all of us to go engage with and use. And I think that until these rules came out, it was, well, there's FHIR. Yeah, but then there's Dave's version of FHIR, and then there's G's version of FHIR, and then there's Drew's version of FHIR. Standard is not a standard unless it's truly a standard. So these rules have given us a place to say, not only should we be API first, but we have something at least common to follow, and then it goes from there. I mean, I think about everything in terms of a maturity curve. FHIR and USCDI is a starting point.
Right.
And I think if we start there and we grow from there, then we can start to get to a point where we can achieve the thing that we all talked about, which is greater liquidity, better experiences, better outcomes, and better innovation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, G. I mean, to me, FHIR and USCDI are kind of a minimal floor. I have in past written some things that were skeptical of FHIR, and I'm eating crow publicly about it these days because I'm impressed with how far they've gotten, how quickly.
Yeah.
And if you ask them, they would say a lot of that is because of the approach that they took, which was community first. I couldn't agree more about API first. Now, again, but what would you expect to hear from me? But it's been interesting, during the pandemic, people have asked me, well, how's your company doing? And, my answer is we're doing pretty good because we are fundamentally enabling this broad use of use cases. So, telehealth is way up, but contact tracing, those sorts of things, they're way, way up. Patient engagement's way, way up. Some other things maybe aren't doing so well right now. The point being that it starts with this ability to connect, exchange data, and I want to underline and in bold say and collaborate. And I think sometimes that's missed in these conversations. This is not simply about pushing data from one place to another. It's really creating the opportunity for applications and for people to collaborate and do in different ways. It's why your friends in the Valley show up and say, well, of course, I'm just going to grab that guy's API, and just like UPS and Amazon, we'll be able to do business together. Well, yeah, no, we're not there yet in healthcare. But the great thing is we can look outside of healthcare and see many examples of how to do this, and evidence that it works, that there's a compelling business case, should give us confidence to move forward aggressively.
Yeah, I think that's true for sure, because I think the applications and the workflows suggest themselves. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in healthcare if the APIs are available. When you think about some of the other API-based apps that are in the market outside of healthcare, they had to do quite a lot of innovation just to make a business model or make the technology. Within healthcare, there's an existing business model, there's existing use cases that need to be implemented. And to G's point, the only thing that's missing is the APIs. So if we can introduce those, it's not a magic wand, but it's definitely a necessary prerequisite to get any of that other work done. So that'll be an exciting next thing to take on decade, I think.
Great. So before we've got a lot of questions here, fellas. Before we get to them, I just I talk to a lot of vendors, big vendors in particular, and the API first message. We still have a little ways to go in some quarters. They're just to inject that little note of kind of realism there. Let's see. So, first question from the audience. And we'll just throw this out. Do you believe that CIOs are looking at the strategic potential of APIs for development and integration? And has that changed in the last couple of years, notwithstanding the rules from the feds?
I'd love to jump on this one.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah,
you start.
Yeah, and with the caveat of any sentence that goes all X are Y is probably a false statement.
Right.
And I can only speak to my own experience, but I spent the last 6 years out hustling, promoting the approach, and I've seen an evolution. Again, I think in the beginning, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding. If you were marinated in healthcare, you just didn't get a lot of exposure. CIOs that come from outside of healthcare were more of a where are these APIs than what are my APIs. I think there's been a phase when they were kind of like, well, this is just another thing. But I have begun to see more of strategic insight, strategic thinking, and speaking specifically about a couple of Datica's health system customers. They are really embracing the API approach as the next generation of how they want to do interoperability within and across organizations. And we're starting to see more of the provider turning to the vendor that wants to sell them something and say, don't talk to me about the integration I'm going to build. Here is my API. You figure out how to connect. And I think that's a great model, and I think there's a lot that's attractive in it. CIOs will typically show you a picture of all the boxes of all the different things they have to manage and maintain. And the minute you want to add another box, you can imagine the reaction. I think this is an opportunity to simplify the connections between those boxes and perhaps even eliminate a few of them.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work with a very highly placed academic medical center before coming to Change, and they had a view on this. Their CIO was, we are going to start with APIs, and the thought process was great. So then coming back out into the rest of the world, as Dave points out, there is a continuum, and in the traditional sense, it's APIs. Yeah, I can have some clinical systems team down there in the bowels of the IT organization take care of that. The reality is some of the newer CIOs and some of the CIOs that are seeing where the winds are blowing are changing that model. We've held a few focus groups with our customers on the provider side, and we've seen that even in the last 2 years, a very market change where our first set of focus groups might have said, yeah, we're thinking about them. That's something that's interesting. We've heard about this Cures Act thing, and we know we might have to do some EHI transport. And now yeah, you can't come to us without the APIs. We want the APIs to plug into our workflows. We want to ensure that we have all the data sitting in front of us so we can start to think about it. So I'm hopeful that trend continues, and as more CIOs jump on this bandwagon of we need to think about simplification, we need to think about cost, really major factor in how we drive our business, and how do we enable the medical side of the house to actually deliver great care. We'll see more adoption and more sense of APIs as a really true solution.
Yeah, because app developers prefer APIs because they have the functionality in their app, but they need the data to operate on. So they're motivated to get the data. And as long as that data is published and documented in a format that they can make sense out of, I think the app developer is willing to meet the data where it is and build whatever they need to get that data, which is something, because the previous model was in like the HL7 V2 world, if an app developer wanted somebody's data, it started a whole negotiation process, right? You had to exchange interface specs and negotiate the parts that didn't match and figure out exactly how fields were used. And, it required a lot of effort on both sides, which doesn't scale for the data holder, right? If he has to talk to 100 app developers, there's no way that he can staff for that. So by telling the data holders, publish your data, document your data, publish it once, and then it's the problem of the app developers to figure out how to match that specification and get the data that they need. That sort of aligns the majority of the work with the people who have the motivation to get the data. So it's from that respect, it's a better model for interoperability, I think.
And it'll drive innovation, we hope, because as Dave points out, all these companies are out there, and there's, and I've seen this directly. You run into the pilot trap. Yeah. How, as a small innovative company, are you going to go into a health system and prove the value of your thing when it takes you 9 months to a year to get the data to do that? So with the APIs in place, hopefully we can decrease that time and we see more innovation happening at the health system.
Yeah, and I think this also plays out in internal politics and governance within organizations as well. It's not an uncommon scenario that, I'd be a chief medical officer and I'm pounding the table about, I got to have this data, or I've got to have this app for this important quality or safety activity. And, my CIO colleague is like looking at me and looking at the amount of work to be done. And we all know that the integration team can be a bottleneck. And I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing the people here. This is more about the tools and the capabilities that they've been given in the past. And so you get into these unfortunate kinds of dynamics where IT is seen as a barrier to progress or improvement. I think there's a real opportunity, based on the reasons we've just talked about, to kind of shift the dynamics of that. And for IT to be more of the wind in the sails and less of a barrier to this kind of innovation and adoption.
So we got a couple of questions, and I'm going to try to digest them all here. What role do you foresee for public HIEs in the future? And I think by extension, it might also be useful to talk about national level network of networks, so things like Care Equality, Commonwealth, and whatever TEFCA turns out to be, who have that sort of public-facing way of interacting with individual participants. So does anybody think that those kinds of organizations have a role to play here?
Yeah. When you think about the APIs that we're talking about for providers, it's mostly patient-centric access to one patient at a time information, which leaves a lot of services uncovered. When you want to think about record locator services, terminology translation services, a lot of those things that sort of depend on coordinating actions or orchestrating actions across organizations, don't have a natural place in the architecture to live, except in a regional HIE, or in the case of Tefca, maybe like a national network of networks. So I think that that can supply some of the broader context to be able to enable some of these cool workflows, and as a place to aggregate data to do analytics, for example.
Service provider for Commonwealth, the opportunity that we have by distributing all of those nodes and getting all that information into a single place really represents, and it's not just Commonwealth, it's all the HIEs as well, gives us those kind of qualified operating nodes to go through to get to the data, so we don't have to create individual connections to every single provider, every single system, because that by itself is a daunting task.
Right.
So having those islands, those qualified nodes, those I hate to use the word clearinghouse because I feel like it's the wrong word, but those clearinghouses where we know the data lives, we know that the data has the right provenance, and that we know the data is accessible, really can help solve the interoperability problem.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are far more expert on this than I am. I'm increasingly skeptical about HIEs as repositories, if you will, because I think with API technology, it's more conceivable to just go to the source of truth and get what you want. But as these fine gentlemen point out, somebody's got to be the pointer to the information. And then there's some other sort of common services that resolving differences in patient identity and things like that, where there may be a place for that kind of thing. But as I said, I'm a little skeptical that the first generation of we'll gather it all together and then it'll be here and you can grab it. I'm not sure that has legs for the long run.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can't solve the problem of data silos by just pouring all the data into a bigger silo.
Right.
You really need. I mean, I think that that model took off because there were technical limitations at the time it was born that made it hard to do your work any other way. But technology has advanced in the 12 years since that model was prevalent. And now we're actually seeing it among our own customer base, a shift from that centralized model to HIEs as a menu of services that providers in their area can subscribe to a la carte.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm sorry. I always think about, there's a guy like G in your company, and he's going to come in tomorrow and he's going to go, I have figured it out. If I could just get the patient's eye color, it would change everything. And in the old world, everybody's going, oh, great, G is back. He has no idea how hard it's going to be to get that data element and expose it. And part of the promise of the API approach is it's actually relatively easy to do that. And I can add it in a way that doesn't break what came before. And I sort of see HIEs as yet another impediment to that kind of thing when they are the repository. So Drew, I love your description of them as emerging as a services organization.
It's a maturity thing. I think as we go from big silos, it's probably a really big quantum leap to get from big silos to truly distributed access to all places. So the HIE are that necessary step. They're the if I get this right, they're the compact disc to the MP3 player. All right, I think healthcare is on cassette tapes today, and we're not going to make the jump directly to electronic music as much as we all want to. So that necessary middle step is there to help everyone get aligned, and then eventually they'll go away.
Here's a question: do the mandated APIs add too much cost for providers? What's in it for the provider? And honestly, I think you could say this for the payers as well. And for any participant, I think first of all, I think yes, it will cost something, but I think we've tried to point out that there's more to this equation than just cost.
Yeah, I mean this is a semi-serious answer, but I mean the cost of not building the APIs is you get kicked out of CMS and you can't bill for most of your patients anymore. So there is something in it for providers for sure. Now, the reason it's not a completely serious answer is because, a mandate is not the same as, direct business value. And I think, like we talked about before, this is direction from the government to say we need to increase the level of interoperability from nearly zero to something measurable. And once we do that, I think the smart organizations will figure out how to turn that into a competitive advantage. The ones who treat it as merely a compliance issue are probably, they're only going to see the cost side of it, and it probably won't be an advantage for them.
Yeah, Dre, I agree. I mean, it's a fine question, but I think a better question is, what's the value? What will be the return for my investment? And to your point, to a great degree, it's going to depend on what you do with it. Are you passive, or do you see it as a strategic advantage, and you go after it and capitalize upon it?
So we got a question here about data security. How is data security going to be ensured when third parties are accessing this kind of data?
It has to be inherent, I think, in the thought process. And we hear this a lot. So you've made an API available, and it follows some standard. But is it secure? Does it have the right privacy protections? Does it perform? So there's and CMS talks about this very, very lightly in the latest rule. There's a role to be played by industry and by vendors in vetting and providing surety around the APIs. And I'll just give you an example. The APIs that we put out into the world, they're not just code. They follow our product vetting process. So our information security team, our privacy team, our performance teams get involved in that thought process of turning it into a product, thinking about it as a product, treating it as a product, and knowing that it is let me think about a product. That's the word I was looking for. That has to have all these protections built in. It is key to driving adoption. But it's less a standard. It's contingent upon industry, upon people like us, to make sure that what we're putting out there follows those rules and follows the commonly available security standards, for example. Yeah,
I don't know that they are inherently more secure, but you can make them quite secure by design, as G is suggesting. I always think in these kinds of discussions, it's important to say, compared to what?
Right.
And my practical experience is, organizations turn on HL7v2 feeds and they forget about them. If you're exchanging flat files, which we're keeping FTP and faxes in business and healthcare, you don't know where that data goes and what happens afterwards. APIs have the ability to have some keys and controls and some logging that can be helpful with those things. It kind of reminds me of the conversation back in the day when we're going to go from paper records to electronic, and people ask, well, won't that be less secure? And well, yeah, in some ways it will, but I grew up in the era where pretty much if you looked official, you could wander into medical records and get a chart. So you have to think about, in safety, security, privacy, they're all relative concepts.
Yeah, I predict that we're going to learn some painful lessons in terms of data misuse, data leaks. Dave said before that that data that's in the EMR does or should belong to the patient. But there's other kinds of data that belong to people, like their web browsing history and their demographic data, their credit history data, and that gets leaked or used, under the terms of service legally. It gets used all the time in ways that people don't realize. And I think that once APIs make it possible to download your healthcare record onto your mobile device, the risk is there that it can be combined with other data or exfiltrated to a marketing or other type of analytics firm that's going to use it in ways you didn't predict. And there are protections in place against that, but I think it's probably going to take some bad experiences to shake out exactly where those lines are and what that's going to look like. We haven't encountered it yet because it's not implemented and widespread yet. But once it is, I think we will see some bad experiences.
So what kind of use cases do you think are driving API adoption right now?
Okay, start.
Yeah.
Sure. Fire away.
I can think of a few that we see a lot of, and it's really on the front end of the experience. How do I drive greater connection between the acquisition of a patient or the conversion of a member to a patient and getting them to that point of first encounter? I think we all hate the clipboard and the H&P that has to get done every time we go into encounter, and so we see a lot of people saying, how do I get that data flow in from a pure CRM perspective? There's the obvious. How do I make the coverage and eligibility transaction through to the claims and payment transaction seamless, so I can decrease the time that it takes and to get the claim in? And how do I ensure that the first time I put that claim in, I'm going to get it paid? Because again, that decreases the amount of time I'm waiting for that payment, the reimbursement to happen. And those are just the two big ones that I see now. And those are all driven again by, how do I create that better experience? How do I prevent churn of a patient, or leakage of that patient out to the other system, because I'm giving him a better experience? And ultimately, how do I drive the financial well-being of my practice from the health system?
Yeah, I'll attack it from a slightly different angle. I think the use cases are broad, and to a large degree, they're driven by individual organizations' priorities or sort of regional competition. What I see broadly is kind of interesting, because at the one end of scale, what you see are smaller entities. And G, I think you referred to this earlier. I'm the guy in the garage with the next big thing. And now I've gone to the big health system, say, this is going to change everything. Yeah, well, how do I plug in? And historically, that's often been the deal killer. You just cannot get past it. So I think it's creating real opportunities at small scale. And then you spoke to the large scale as well. So interoperability across these large back-end systems, integrating my CRM and my payment system with my clinical data. That's creating new capabilities that can be a real competitive advantage for organizations.
Drew, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think that's a good cross-section of the use cases that we're encountering there. The ones that are sort of embedded into the rule involve, the patient being in control of their clinical and claims data and being able to send it where they want. And I mean, from there, you can build off lots of interesting use cases.
Great. So that brings us to the end of our presentation today, our webinar. I want to thank everyone who clicked in. I want to thank our handsome devil panelists. Each and every one was fantastic. If there's a takeaway here for any payer or provider, I think it's that, part of being an API first, adopting that sort of set of ideas is that you really need to think about these new requirements as a floor, and that they present way more opportunities than they do cost. So thank you very much, and that will conclude our webinar.